from the Surrey History Centre at Woking, and he's going to talk to us this evening about the Manning and Bray history of Surrey. Julie.
Okay, thank you very much. No, I need some little bit more light than that, otherwise we'll be here all night while I try and see the notes.
Is that okay? You know, it's going to be reflected too much on.
Yeah, it's a little bit less. Can you put them on behind or not?
The top ones, top ones.
It's the other way.
That's perfect. How's that?
Ah.
So you can see it. Can you hear it?
Yeah.
Okay, that's excellent. Well, thank you very much indeed for inviting me here to speak to you tonight. I think I came to you a couple of years ago and spoke about Surrey's mental hospitals and their history. Some of you might remember that.
Yes.
A lot of things have happened since then. I think this is only the second talk I've given to real people rather than Zoom this year. I mean, it's a lovely experience being with everyone again, so thank you very much. This is one of those talks that brings together my own personal research, which I do when I'm not at Surrey History Centre, and my day job. So just to put it in context, and the reason why I'm standing here tonight. When I was a student at London University reading medieval history, I spent most of my grant in the 1980s on beer and books. Not necessarily in that order. And it'll come back, it did that a minute ago. And one day in Flask Walk bookshop in Hampstead, some of you might know it, down Flask Walk, I came across a little book about as big as my fist, which was a collection of pocket diaries written in the 1820s and 1830s by somebody who had links with Hampstead. I held it up to the streetlight because it was a dark evening, and I could see the word Hampstead, and I thought, this looks good, £6. If I'm going to be an archivist, which was my chosen career, I need to be able to read this sort of handwriting. So I bought it, and it sat on my shelves while I did my degree, and it sat on my shelves while I trained to be an archivist in my postgrad diploma. And then when I was waiting for a job to come up, I thought, I need to keep my handwriting skills in check. I'll transcribe that diary. And I sat at home in Worcestershire and started typing it out on an old typewriter. And there were a few names I recognised. But halfway through doing that, I read an article in a publication called The Local Historian, which some of you may take. And it was about the Gentleman's Magazine, which some of you may know, world's first magazine, very interesting for local history. And the chap who wrote the article said, first a little bit about the people who wrote who edited this magazine for 3 generations. And he started to talk about the Nichols family of printers based in London. And I suddenly realised, putting 2 and 2 together from the evidence in this diary, that what I'd found was a diary written by the granddaughter of the printer of Manning and Bray. So that led me on a whole new research pathway, which I'm still following, which is the subject of another talk. I'm not going to bore you with that this evening. And then I applied for a job in Surrey. And I walked in, and I got the job at Surrey Record Office in Kingston. I walked into the search room, which some of you may remember, in County Hall. I certainly remember seeing Brian there.
He's not that old.
In the archive?
And then on the shelves were these 3 books, Manning and Bray's County History of Surrey. So my research interests into the background of this printing family of Fleet Street suddenly merged with my day job. And so this talk has developed from both of those strands. So in 1911, H.E. Malden, who was the editor of the Victoria History of the County of Surrey, warmly acknowledged the achievements of 2 men who at the end of the 18th century have produced a history of the county of lasting value to historical research. If slips and omissions do occur in their work, he wrote, it is difficult to overestimate their industry and care. Their general accuracy is wonderful, considering especially the absence of those catalogues, indexes and printed calendars which aid the modern topographer and genealogist. The History and Antiquities of the County of Surrey, published in 3 volumes in 1804, 1809 and 1814, and reprinted in 1974, is still an invaluable reference tool for scholars from a range of disciplines, a starting point for research in Surrey's archaeology, landscape, buildings, industry and ecology, a source for family and local historians, and an indispensable guide for the county's religious history. This evening, I'm going to examine the achievement of these two early local historians within the context of antiquarian scholarship and publication. In discussing the careers and interests of these two men, one a cleric with a passion for medieval history, the other a solicitor immersed in the records of his native county, I hope to show how they were inextricably linked, not only with the busy network of antiquaries throughout Surrey, but also with a wider republic of letters which formed the 18th century academic community. Antiquaries have often received a bad press, but I think that we should acknowledge the debt that we owe to their inquiries. Though some have seen a decline in research standards between the time of William Stukely in the early 18th century and the rigorous historical discipline of Sir Richard Colt in the early 19th century, urban and county historians, topographical artists and engravers, bibliophiles and collectors are now acknowledged to have made important contributions to the promotion of historical research and the study of the materials of the past. Their correspondence reflects their industry and enthusiasm, and the pages of publications like the Gentleman's Magazine bear witness to the breadth of their achievements. Their networks of friendships provided the impetus for the later foundations of county archaeological societies, natural history clubs, and national and local record publishing societies. Manning and Bray, and those who helped them, shared a sense of the importance of antiquarian study in the wider sphere of their contemporary culture. The writing of local history in the 18th century was rooted in the growth of the county as an administrative unit and the rise of the landed classes and the pride that people felt in their local area. Since the reign of Elizabeth, the county had become an essential tool of national government. The gentry, as justices of the peace, came together regularly at the county quarter sessions, and they saw their pedigrees and their title deeds as endorsements of their rights to undertake their judicial and administrative responsibilities. Archives were examined, estates surveyed, maps drawn up, and rights to property scrutinised. Often this interest engendered local pride in the county's history and a desire to publish it as a testament to the achievements and continuing honour of the families who ran it. In the 18th century, as today, historical research could grow from legal disputes. A number of our customers at Surrey History Centre have become interested in local history through using historic maps to settle boundary disputes or quarrels over rights of way. Owen Manning's history of Brayburth Manor near Guildford was written for the Mormonites family in 1784 and survives in the Loseley manuscripts. And after Manning's death, William Bray was asked to check his papers to assist in settling the disputed Compton Enclosure Award. But it could work both ways, because John Nichols, who printed this work, but who was also the author of the even larger History and Antiquities of the County of Leicestershire, feared that some Leicestershire families might withhold their records for fear that their title to the property would not survive closer inspection. See if I can nudge that back. We'll come back in a minute. Antiquarian study was essential to the spirit of public inquiry and a key part of a gentleman's education. In 1758, Francis Wise of Oxford noticed in his letter to Dr. Richard Mead concerning the antiquities of Berkshire that young gentlemen had been taught to reckon this study amongst their chiefest personal accomplishments. Richard Gough, of whom I'll come back to shortly, saw antiquarianism as a public duty. He believed that the study of local history, monuments and records and the achievements of county families would equip a man for public duties, engender national identity and promote the nation's reputation abroad. And here in this slide of St. Catherine's Chapel outside Guildford, you can see two antiquaries surveying the ruins. Antiquarianism was also closely linked to scientific inquiry. He was part of the contemporary zeal to identify and arrange and classify. Gentlemen filled their cabinets of curiosity with fossils, coins and wax copies of medieval seals. Again, Richard Gough saw antiquarianism as a key discipline at a time when every part of science is advancing to perfection. And this is reflected in the frequent joint membership of the Royal Society and the Society of Antiquaries. Sir Joseph Banks, perhaps the most eminent botanist of his day, was keenly interested in the antiquities of his native Lincolnshire and served on the council of the Society of Antiquaries. And Owen Manning was a Fellow of the Royal Society for 3 years before his election to the Antiquaries in 1770. Antiquaries were urged to approach their studies scientifically. Sources should be collected, preserved, identified and verified and tested against each other to exacting standards of accuracy. Gough and his followers aimed to present these documents as historical evidence, leaving the reader to draw their own conclusions. In stressing that an antiquary should provide full references for his sources while not allowing his opinion to cloud the narrative, the later 18th century antiquaries were laying the foundations for modern historical scholarship. But that's not to say that antiquaries were universally respected. People took a lot of fun out of them too. This is a lovely cartoon by Thomas Rowlandson, the antiquary's last will and testament, with death creeping up to pounce at any moment. Antiquarianism was at odds with the polite taste of the 18th century. Horace Walpole sneered at the interest in England's medieval history as a misguided insularity, and he dismissed Richard Gough and Owen Manning's enthusiasm for Anglo-Saxon literature as a misguided interest in a barbaric past. Like others who came home from going on the grand tour, Walpole looked to classical antiquities of Greece and Rome for inspiration, and he read the works of Homer and Virgil in preference to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle or Domesday Book. A bit rich, one might think, for someone who ended up writing the first Gothic novel and created his own citadel of medieval romance at Strawberry Hill. I think that what really irritated Walpole was what he saw as the pedantry of antiquaries in small things. Writing to William Cole of Milton in Cambridgeshire in 1782, he caustically remarked that Mr. Gough is apt, as antiquaries are, to be impatient to tell the world all he knows, which unluckily is a lot more than the world wants to hear. This is precisely what made Richard Gough so influential among his contemporaries and why he's so important and fascinating to us today. He hated having his picture taken, by the way. He would never have taken a selfie or posed for a portrait. This sketch, which I found in somebody's attic a few years ago, was taken without his knowledge. His insistence on the need to rediscover the English medieval past in order to fully appreciate the present lies behind the lasting success of Manning & Bray's History of Surrey, as it does with so many of the more important local histories of his day. And it's worth taking a few moments to look at him in more detail. He was educated at Bennet's Hall in Cambridge, part of Corpus Christi College, where he became very influenced by the writings of and scholarship established there by Archbishop Parker and William Stukely. When he left in 1756, he followed in Stukely's footsteps, making a tour to Peterborough, Stamford and Croyland Abbey. These tours became an annual event and were made in the company of other like-minded friends. Let others traipse to Italy in search of historic inspiration, Gough found his amidst the parish churches and country houses of England, and was very pleased to admit it. Despite his published histories of Croyland Abbey and Pleshy in Essex, Gough was much more of an editor and an energetic correspondent than he was a county historian. As director of the Society of Antiquaries in the 1770s and 80s, joint editor with John Nichols of the Bibliotheca Topographica Britannica from 1780, and chief reviewer of the Gentleman's Magazine for 1786, he was at the very centre of the antiquarian network. His first published work of importance was called Anecdotes of British Topography, came out in 1767, in which he presented a list of both published and unpublished local historical research for the whole of Great Britain and Ireland. That's quite an achievement. It also listed public records, chronicles, heraldic visitations, maps and engravings related to the antiquities of Great Britain, and it formed the starting point for many local histories. But that was just the start. His next work, Sepulchral Monuments, appeared in 2 volumes in the 1780s, and it grew from his interest in church monuments, but was novel because he saw tombs and sepulchral art, the carving that you find on them, as an untapped source for the study of the people they commemorated and the manners and customs of their times. They started doing this in France, but Gough brought that interest into England, and the plates for that work are absolutely stunning. Here you see John Stratford's tomb in Canterbury Cathedral. Many of these, I think including this one, were sketched by a young artist called William Blake, who at that time was apprenticed to the engraver of these plates, James Bazier. Blake later traced his own interest in medieval style to these very early commissions. Gough's sepulchral monuments introduced art history to antiquarianism. It no longer simply relied on written texts, and yet, even here, Gough was the subject of scurrilous gossip. Michael Tyson told William Cole that when Gough had been present at the exhumation of the body of Edward I in Westminster Abbey in 1778, he tried to slip a finger from the dead king into his pocket, but they caught him out red-handed and he had to return it. And good old Rollinson was there to record it. You can just see, there's a program, isn't there? You can just see Gough pulling the finger off here, and there's death waiting to pounce for the appalling crime he's committing. So antiquaries generally looked to Edmund Gibson's revision and translation of William Camden's Britannia, which had been published in 1695, as the point of reference for their research. But it was in Latin, so Gough translated it into English and updated it. And in doing so, he visited every English county and drew on the knowledge of his extensive network of antiquarian friends. He instructed his printer, John Nichols, to send proof sheets of that work to anyone who might be able to add something to them. And the resulting volumes are a testament to the industry and achievements of the antiquarian enterprise in the late 18th century. Manning and Bray were part of that network. But Gough was at its centre, pulling those strings of friendship to encourage local historians across the country to exchange manuscripts and artefacts, check each other's references, and help each other with knotty problems of difficult handwriting. Gough was particularly keen to rehabilitate the study of Anglo-Saxon history. Its very obscurity demanded attention, but with the Hanoverian monarchy, there was patriotic pride in tracing the nation's Saxon roots. But though Gibson had traced the foundation of English law and language to a glorious Saxon past, standards of Saxon scholarship had declined since the disastrous fire of Sir Robert Cotton's library in 1731. If you ever go to the British Library to look at Anglo-Saxon manuscripts, like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and various works by Bede, they often have them in exhibitions, you'll notice that the edges are very black. That's because Sir Robert Cotton had hoovered them up and had them in his own collection at his house in London. And he had a terrible house fire. And many of our medieval records were lost in that fire. So what we have today is a miraculous survival, but you'll often find that it's pretty tattered and burnt round the edges. Gough worked with Saxon scholars such as Edward Lye and Daines Barrington to ensure that the surviving Saxon manuscripts were not overlooked by antiquaries in their search for the origins of later 18th century government and culture. This interest probably brought him into contact with Owen Manning. Although we know Manning as the historian of Surrey, he was in fact primarily an Anglo-Saxon scholar and a lexicographer. There's a picture of him here. You may have seen this. That hangs on the wall in Godalming Museum. He was born in 1721 in Northamptonshire and educated in Cambridge, where he's said to have suffered 2 near-death experiences. The first was when he was thought to have died of smallpox and was actually laid out for burial before somebody noticed signs of life. And the second was when he fell into the River Cam during an epileptic fit and was believed to have drowned. He studied Anglo-Saxon language and manuscripts throughout his life and was the very first person to publish the text of the will of King Alfred. In 1771, Richard Gough, writing to Daines Barrington about his proposed translation of Erosius, described Manning as very conversant in Saxon matters and an ideal person to correct Barrington's translation as it went through the press. After 8 years as a chaplain to the Bishop of Lincoln, Manning was presented to the rectory of Chiddingfold here in Surrey in 1760 and to the vicarage of Godalming in 1763, and he brought those scholarly interests with him. In 1772 he completed the work of his friend Edward Lye in completing a Saxon and Gothic dictionary. He saw it through the press and made a lot of improvements to it himself. Manning skillfully combined his academic skills with his pastoral duties. He was drawn to the history of Surrey and began to gather materials for its history. And that, of course, was very typical for a clergyman of his day. Numerous examples can be found of clerical antiquaries making historical collections from the registers and records in their care. Local historical research and the exchange of ideas on antiquarian topics with like-minded men throughout the country could serve as an intellectual lifeline for an isolated country parson. Those like Manning who provided Richard Gough with local information or who contributed letters to the Gentleman's Magazine were immediately part of that antiquarian network and historical community. Manning's interest in Surrey's history attracted the notice of other Surrey local historians. When William Bray of Shear wrote to him in 1767 asking about these plans for a county history, Manning invited him to join him in the project rather than cooperating with Mr. H, as Bray apparently proposed doing. It took me ages to work out who Mr. H was, but it was Henry Hill, a herald, son of the Reverend Henry Hill of Guildford. He'd been gathering his own materials for a county history since the 1750s, largely from published works like those by John Aubrey and Nathaniel Salmon, but also from manuscripts held by the College of Arms where he worked and other London offices. We hold 2 volumes of his notes at Surrey History Centre, and although they include some fantastic information about local customs and buildings and Surrey families, there's no way that they were ever ready for publication, but there's some brilliant sketches in them. Here you see, but you don't know what that is. It looks like some kind of digestive system. It's a ground plan of the caves in Guildford, which he surveyed. And here is his measured drawing of Guildford Bridge. Typical of antiquaries, pacing everything out to understand exactly how it's constructed. That's his sketch of the Guildford civic regalia belonging to the borough. And here he's drawn some early tradesmen's tokens, a form of coinage. William Bray had already been assisting Daniel Lysons, the curate of Putney, in his study of the Surrey parishes closest to London, and he agreed that Manning stood a much better chance of seeing his work into print, though at that stage he preferred to leave Manning to forge ahead on his own and act as a consultant rather than a partner. So initially, Manning's interest in completing Lye's Saxon dictionary and gathering materials for Surrey had equal claims on his time. His letter of the 24th of January 1768, now held at Harvard University, shows that he was equally busy borrowing and copying Saxon manuscripts as he was in seeking copies of documents relating to Surrey. His knowledge of administrative history had an important impact upon these Surrey studies. Other county historians based their studies on the ancient divisions of the county and their constituent parishes, but Manning decided to do it very differently. He looked at the county through the ownership of its manors, and he realised that Domesday Book linked Surrey's Saxon past with that redistribution of land ownership that took place under the Norman kings. And so he looked at all of the king's manors together first, wherever they lay, in the first part of his county history. and then account of the descent of the ownership of each of Surrey's manors would then follow through to modern times. But he wanted to go one step further than all of that. He wanted to publish a facsimile copy of Surrey Domesday Book with a detailed translation of the text. And that was no easy task. But it was in that same spirit of public inquiry that underlied so much of antiquarian research. His work predated the pioneering work of John Nichols and Joseph Jackson that resulted in the first printed facsimile of Domesday Book in 1783. If you wanted to see Domesday Book in those days, there was no National Archives to go to. It was actually kept in the chapter house at Westminster Abbey. It cost 8 shillings and 6pence to get in, and then you paid 4pence for every line transcribed. So don't complain to me about our photocopying costs. Yeah. Manning wanted to provide his readers with their own copy, but tracing the original manuscript and then copying that tracing onto a copper plate so that it could be engraved would require a very skilled craftsman and be a costly commission. The Cotton Fire of 1731 had shown antiquaries and civil servants that the records of state were vulnerable. Publication provided an insurance against fire and loss, and one of the leading figures in the project to publish state records was Philip Carteret Webb, the MP for Haslemere, Solicitor to the Treasury, and energetic local historian. Both Webb and Gough were central to the efforts of the Society of Antiquaries to encourage publication of Domesday, and they led debates about how best to do it. Should it be engraved or could it be printed? How should the difficult handwriting be treated? The ambitious plans of the Society of Antiquaries to prepare a complete edition of the work in an engraved facsimile founded upon the sheer scale of the cost. The estimate for engraving alone came to nearly £7,000, and a further cost of copper, printing and paper would have brought the total to nearly £13,000 then, about 1.6 million today. So it was left to county historians like Manning for Surrey or Treadway Nash for Worcestershire to forge ahead on their own with engraved facsimiles of their own county sections. And again, it was Richard Gough who was the key player in all of these projects. Manning's letters to him, which are now held by the Bodleian Library in Oxford, show that Gough was the middleman between Manning and the two engravers he employed. He lost patience with the first chap, Bailey, finding him a lazy, scuffling sort of fellow. In 1773, he settled upon Benjamin Pouncey, a draftsman and engraver who specialised in this stuff and had already made some tracings from Domesday Book for engraving. His work was excellent, but he was slow and his fees were exorbitant. Both Manning and Gough realised they had to indulge him. No one else could undertake the task or was on such good terms with Abraham Farley, the keeper of the manuscript, whose signature Manning needed to authenticate the accuracy of each plate. In 1776, Manning lamented to Gough that there was no alternative to paying Pouncey's exorbitant fees. "We're in his hands," he said, "and he knows it." Gough tried to talk Pouncey down, but in vain, observing to Manning that Mr. P is a gentleman artist and thinks himself at liberty to make what decision he pleases. Let's see if we can get that back. We'll come back in a minute, no doubt. There you go. The resulting plates, as you can see here, justified the fees and are seen as a landmark in facsimile publication. Manning bound the proof sheets into the second volume of his manuscript of the History of Surrey, which we have at the History Centre. So that's one, and you can see this is all engraved, it's not printed. And it's been through the engraving press twice because you can see there's two different colours on there, red and black. They didn't print them at the same time. You had to go through again and be exactly accurate. And there we are, there's a detail of it there. Richard Gough was delighted with the result. In August 1774, he wrote to John Price at the Bodleian Library, "It were to be wished that all county histories might have their Domesday engraved on so liberal a plan as Mr. Manning has given for Surrey." And in 1775, somewhat disingenuously, He recommended Pouncey to Dr. Treadway Nash of Worcestershire, who was planning to do something similar. If you're not provided with the person to trace and engrave Doomsday, I would take the liberty of recommending to you Mr. Pouncey of Mays Buildings, who's just finished Surrey Doomsday for a particular friend of mine. He has great merit in his art and will, I dare say, be as reasonable for you as he was for Mr. Manning. Manning's research was not confined to state records. He corresponded with local landowners and made field trips to Surrey landmarks. In August 1781, he cheerfully told Gough that, "I'm still in pursuit of my favourite work, and I never pass a day without giving it all the attention in my power. The week your letter came to hand, I was out on a visit relative to it at Dorking and Reigate, and last week I reconnoitred Leith Hill, Holmbury St Mary and Hanstonbury camps, of both of which I procured an exact survey." And you can see those surveys in the book today. We also know that he tried the trusted measure of a mail shot to the gentry and clergy of Surrey in an effort to draw them into his research and seek their local advice. The county circular or questionnaire was of course nothing new. Robert Plott had used one in the 17th century, and Richard Rawlinson had also done so when revising the Surrey collections of John Aubrey. Since then, so many antiquaries used them for their own local studies that John Nichols included a history of the county questionnaire in one of his publications in 1780. The idea was to send a list of questions to the clergy and the gentry, asking them to answer for their parish or estate. It was a great idea, but it quickly got out of hand. Francis Peck's questionnaire relating to Leicestershire and Rutland in 1729 had run to 102 questions and included such treasures as, "What new do you have to the management of bees or fish ponds?" Or, "What accounts have you of children crying in the womb?" Nichols sought to harness the questionnaire more firmly to the scientific approach promoted by Richard Gough. The 56 questions in his suggested template ranged from parish boundaries to population statistics and included dimensions of churches and historic monuments, the names of previous incumbents, famous inhabitants, descriptions of local industries, fairs, markets and customs. Manning's questionnaire was more modest. It was later printed by Nichols in his Literary Anecdotes of the 18th century, but I found the manuscript of it in somebody's attic, and you can see it here. He simply uses the questionnaire to announce his interest in Surrey, the scope of his project, and inquire whether the recipient, and you can see that he's left a space blank for the recipient's name, was able to help him. Later, in 1801, when Bray took up the challenge of completing the work, the same circular was used, with Bray's name substituted for Manning's. Manning collected materials for the history of Surrey for over 30 years, and by 1796, the antiquarian community was eagerly awaiting the appearance of his work in print. The introduction was written, Doomsday Book was transcribed, but his voluminous notes on each parish remained to be digested, and he was reluctant to go to press before that part of the work was ready. The strain of such study was taking its toll, and like so many early local historians, he lost his sight and the project hung in jeopardy. The fact of the matter is that writing a county history was simply too much for one man. The founding father himself, John Leyland, had gone mad. Sampson Erdiswick, first county historian of Staffordshire, was described as being oftentimes crazed, especially in his last years. Benjamin Hutchinson worked on Huntingdonshire for 30 years before insanity killed him in 1804. I'm not selling local history, am I? And both Edward Hastings of Kent and George Lipscombe of Buckinghamshire wrote part of their county histories in debtors' prisons. In Dorset, Richard Gough and John Nichols joined forces to see the work of John Hutchins through the press after his health failed. And when Manning died in 1801, they realised that once again they would need to steer his work to completion. This seems to have been completely in accordance with Manning's wishes. Letters from Thomas Collinson of Eashing to Richard Gough, again now in the Bodleian Library, show that he passed Manning's research notes to Gough in the summer of 1800, several months before Manning died, with detailed instructions by Manning as to the intended layout and format of the work. But while Gough was happy to help, he was too old now to take on the project alone, and Nichols himself was completely absorbed in his own county history of Leicestershire. So it fell to Manning's friend and collaborator, William Bray, to complete the work. His letter to Nichols, dated the 23rd of September 1801, just 2 weeks after Manning's death, now preserved with Nichols' papers at Yale University in Connecticut, clearly shows the spirits of public inquiry which led him to do so. The County of Surrey look to you to fulfil the hopes long entertained of seeing my friend Mr. Manning's collections published. I flatter myself you will not disappoint. If my poor services could be of any use to you, I need not say that you may readily command them. William Bray was, of course, the ideal person to complete Manning's history of Surrey. This is a portrait of him by John Linnell, still in private hands. I often think he looks very much like William Hartnell, the first Doctor Who. He was a collateral descendant of Sir Reginald Bray, Minister of Henry VII, who obtained the manor of Shear in 1486. Bray was born in Shear in 1736 and lived there until his death in 1832, aged 96. If Manning represented the erudite clerical antiquary, Bray should be seen as typical of the other kind of local historian, a county lawyer whose interest in antiquities grew from his professional duties. He'd been educated at Rugby School and trained as a lawyer under Mr. Martyr in Guildford. But his success as a solicitor owed as much to his personality as it did to his energy and professional skills. In 1761 he became a clerk to the Board of Green Cloth, which managed the domestic affairs of the royal household, through the patronage of John Evelyn of Wootton. Although the post required him to live in London, its light demands enabled him to develop a successful legal practice in Great Russell Street, acting for many families and charities in London, Surrey and Middlesex. Bray had been fascinated by the history of Surrey since his youth, and his professional advancement only served to increase his taste for travel and research. His diaries, which survive from his late teenage years, list the history books that he purchased and his subscriptions to periodicals like the Gentleman's Magazine. In 1767, he supplied Philip Morant, the historian of Essex, with transcripts of manuscripts at the British Museum. And by 1768, he was regularly dining with Sir Joseph Aloff and Thomas Astle, keepers of the state papers, John Topham, librarian to the Archbishop of Canterbury, Andrew Du Carroll, librarian at Lambeth Palace, and Craven Ord, vice president of the Antiquaries. They went on visits together to Kenwood House, Osterley Park, and Strawberry Hill, making detailed notes of the architecture, the fittings, and the art collections that they saw. There's Bray's notes of his trip to Strawberry Hill in 1774. Other friends included Daniel Solander, keeper of the Natural History Department at the British Museum, and Michael Lort, Professor of Greek at Cambridge. The Antiquarian Society was closely knit, and people came together in all sorts of ways from different backgrounds there. Like Gough, Bray made tours throughout England and Wales in search of antiquities, and one of these resulted in 1777 in his first published work, Sketch of a Tour into Derbyshire and Yorkshire, which was sufficiently popular to be republished in 1783. He was a regular correspondent of the Gentleman's Magazine. Here's one of his early contributions. It does not sign Bray, it's signed AZ, which we know was the signature that he used when writing for magazines. You never gave your name, that was far too low. You hid behind a pseudonym. So this is his description of Clarendon and the churches at East and West Clarendon in 1798, with a couple of engravings that he found. He describes the stained glass, and he notes that at West Clarendon the roof collapsed one Sunday morning just before Christmas service in 1716. He also tells us that about 30 years previously, about 1768, the church had been given a new ceiling and neatly pewed by the Lord Richard Onslow, and he describes the monumental inscriptions in both those churches. After his election as a Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries in 1772, and as a typical election of a Fellow by Thomas Rowlandson, it's the same today. Nothing's changed, just the wigs, I suppose. You don't know those anymore, but he looks just the same. After his election as a fellow in 1772, he published 29 articles in their Transactions called Archaeologia. As a solicitor to Surrey's landed families, a steward of Surrey's manors, and treasurer of Henry Smith's charity, William Bray was uniquely qualified to complete Manning's county history. His professional duties gave him such ready access to deeds, papers and manorial records in family muniment rooms throughout the county that his spidery hand is found almost ubiquitously in the records of Surrey's churches, charities, manors and estates that we now hold at Surrey History Centre. His familiarity with the records of state at that time, long before the coming of the National Archives, scattered among more than 60 government offices in London, and his easy friendship with scholars around the country enabled him to draw on the wider expertise of the antiquarian community. In 1800, John Nichols had printed Bray's second work, A History of Henry Smith's Charity, which clearly established Bray's credentials as a local historian. Nichols and Gough seem to have had little trouble in persuading Bray to take on the county history. The negotiations with Bray were recorded by Nichols' son, John Bowyer Nichols, in his little pocket diary for the 7th of January 1802, where he wrote, "My father and Mr. Bray and Mr. White went to Mr. Gough's about Manning and Bray's History of Surrey, and from this visit originated Manning and Bray's county history." I rather think that Bray did not quite realise what he was letting himself in for. His printed prospectus for the history of Surrey, which came out in 1802, implied that Manning's notes had only to be arranged for the printer, and the whole work would be published in just 2 volumes by 1804. In the event, Volume 1 did not appear until 1804, and the work stretched to 3 volumes that were not completed until 1814. What caused that delay? What extra work did he find was necessary? Well, helpfully, Bray's prefaces to the 3 volumes as they appeared allow us to chart the course of its publication and the difficulties that he faced. The first problem, of course, was the sheer scale of the project. He very quickly realised that Manning had only written up notes of 5 parishes. The rest of that gentleman's very extensive collections, he wrote, consisted in notes put down as they occurred, and a reference to the original records was necessary in many instances. In many, a search after others was indispensable. And here you see typical page from Manning's notes, scribbled out, sketches inserted, all of which Bray had to work through to verify and correct. Bray's diaries and research papers provide a fascinating insight into the working methods of a county historian and the ways in which his professional life as a lawyer dovetailed into his own research. That's a typical page from his diary. They're only about that big, by the way. They're tiny little books. His handwriting is very small. He took every opportunity in the course of his work as a lawyer to visit churches and copy inscriptions. So here's some of his notes of his visit to Canterbury Cathedral. If he was attending the assizes in Kingston, he'd nip into the church to transcribe an inscription. Or if he was visiting clients in the county, he would allow plenty of time on the way there and on the way back to pop into some churches. When in London, he would catch up on work at the office in Great Russell Street early in the morning, before spending several hours working on records at the Tower of London, the Rolls Chapel and Chapter House at Westminster, or the Exchequer Office in the Temple. During the summer, when legal business slowed down, he would devote most of his time to this research. He was a regular at Lambeth Palace Library and the British Museum, where his friend, Richard Pennick, rector of Abinger, was librarian. The financial accounts in the end papers of his diaries itemised the cost of his research, postage of letters, fees for consulting the parish records, usually a shilling to the parish clerk, and charges for transcribing wills in Doctors' Commons. Bray claimed to have visited every parish church that he described and examined the monuments in all but 2 churches, as well as measuring the windows and other architectural features. If he had more to say, such as a detailed description of the grotto at Oatlands near Weybridge or a visit to Moor Park in Farnham, he would continue that in a separate journal. These longer descriptions testify to Bray's wide itinerary and his keen eye for detail. He also worked through the papers of earlier Surrey historians, John Aubrey and Richard Rawlinson at the Bodleian Library. But travelling was not without its risks. On the 3rd of April in 1813, Bray was in the Dorking coach descending a hill when a spring broke, and his friend, Mr. Upcott, who I'll come back to in a minute, was thrown from the box, his face much cut, and they had to stop at Epsom for him to be bled. I never quite understood, if your face is big, well, never mind. People liked Bray, and they trusted him with their records. After all, he was often their family lawyer. He regularly stayed at Loseley to consult the manuscript treasures of the Moore Molyneux's family. And he also spent much time at Sutton Place, dining with Mr. Weston and inspecting old deeds. On the 6th of October 1808, we read that he rode to Esher, to Mr. Diggle, inspected his registers and papers for the history of Esher, and he went with me into the church, broke open the chest, and lent me the register and some papers. Other gentlemen of the county who allowed him access to their records were John Whitewick of Sandgates near Chertsey, Mr. Lilly of Peckham, Mr. Shotter of Farnham, and Mr. Corner of Southwark. And again, Bray's engaging personality shines through these letters. In May 1813, he began a letter listing further inquiries to Mr. Corner by saying, "There's an old proverb against riding a free horse to death, but you have so good a bottom, I'm not afraid to try you." We've already seen how Manning used a questionnaire to seek information and how Bray reused it when he took over the work. Many of Bray's letters were very similar to questionnaires. As you can see on this slide, this is a letter to Mr. Middleton of Lambeth. He would ask many long questions here in the margin on one side of the paper, and then he would leave his correspondent to send it back to him by filling in the other side. It's a bit like instant text messaging. It's the WhatsApp of the late 18th century. Many of Bray's colleagues shared his interest. Among them were 3 Reigate lawyers, William Bryant, Richard Barnes and Ambrose Glover. Bryant had accumulated many materials relating to Surrey when disentangling the voting rights of the borough of Reigate, and he made these available to Bray. Ambrose Glover, articled clerk and later partner of Richard Barnes, put at Bray's disposal his own history of Reigate Priory and documents relating to the east of the county. On the 6th of December 1806, Bray spent 2 days with him at Reigate, working on deeds and papers, and his accounts showed that he also bought a box of music for Glover's daughter. They visited churches in the east of the county together and shared an enthusiasm for archaeology. Here you can see some of Glover's notes here. This is Manning's handwriting, that's Glover's, that's Richard Goff, this is William Bray, and then we go back down here to Richard Goff again. Bray could also, of course, tap into the wider antiquarian network for further information. Daniel Lysons, the author of The Environs of London, allowed Bray to use his collections for those parishes closest to the metropolis. Questions on coinage could be referred to Rogers Ruding, author of the Annals of Coinage, who was rector of Malden in Surrey, and with Bray, a leading member of the Society of Antiquaries. William Upcott, seen here, who we've already met in that unfortunate Dorking coach, was librarian of the London Institution and able to tell Bray about authors associated with the county. At the same time as Bray was researching Surrey's history, he and Upcott discovered the diary of John Evelyn among the family papers at Wootton, and in 1818 they were the first to print it and bring it to public attention. Craven Ord arranged for Bray to have access to the Chertsey Abbey cartulary at the Exchequer, and no doubt shared his extensive knowledge of Surrey's monumental brasses. Ord was a pioneer of the study of monumental brasses. He formed a huge collection of rubbings, always carrying with him on his tours throughout England some damp French paper in a specially prepared case, printer's ink and a quantity of rags. He would ink the brass, then wipe it clean, lay the paper down on it, and then carefully tread all over it. The outlines, as you can see here, were then finished at home and cut out. William Hamper of Birmingham lent Bray deeds relating to Abinger and Camberwell, and Richard Yates, the curate of Chelsea College, checked his collection of Suffolk epitaphs for the Gainsford family. If Bray needed to look further afield for manuscripts, Richard Gough could always provide the necessary introductions or procure them on his behalf. Not everything was returned, however. In 1814, Ralph Churton of Oxford wrote to ask Nichols if he knew what had happened to the William Scott manuscript of Surrey, lent by Dr. Loveday to Mr. Gough from Mr. Bray in 1804. Churton was concerned to find it listed in the recent sale catalogue of Gough's manuscripts, and would doubtless have been horrified that it had been knocked down to Mr. Scott for 6 shillings and sixpence. So it's easy to see how the history of Surrey grew into 3 huge volumes, but there were other reasons for the delay in publication that I'll discuss in the last part of this paper. The most damaging of these was the fire that ripped through the Nichols printing house on the evening of the 8th of February 1808. Fires were a very common hazard in the cramped courts and alleys of London's printing community in the early 19th century. Nichols's office in Red Lion Passage in Fleet Street was one of the largest in London, not only printing for Parliament and learned societies, but also serving as the headquarters for the Gentleman's Magazine. It was crammed with correspondence and paperwork. Amidst the huge printing presses and stacks of crisp paper, apprentices and journeyman printers fried mutton chops on open fires. It's true, I found a letter about it. See, the thing is, it's so narrow, this alleyway. This is what's left of the printing house here. On the other side, within touching distance, was the Red Lion pub. And they would fry their mutton chops in the printing office, and the pub owner would hand them beer through the window. So yeah, it was a dangerous place, really. It was a tinderbox, and when both printing office and warehouse went up that night, Nichols lost nearly £30,000 worth of stock and equipment, which is about £1.25 million today. He also lost the entire stock of the Gentleman's Magazine from 1783, the last part of his own history of Leicestershire, much of John Hutchins's history of Dorset, other histories of Cheshire and Cornwall, and 330 pages of Volume 2 of Bray's History of Surrey. Nichols wrote to Gough daily. On the 15th of February he reported, "Mr. Bray is all goodness. There will be little inconvenience except expense about the Surrey." He'd been sending Gough the Surrey sheets to proofread, and now he begged him, as you can see clearly in this letter here. Isn't that writing appalling? This is John Nichols's best handwriting, I have to say. He is one of the worst hands of the 18th century. But this letter to Gough says, lay aside the Surrey proof sheets as they turn up so that we don't have to chase after them. By the 15th of March, temporary presses had been set up in Nichols's house and work on Surrey could begin again. But it had been a bad setback. Gough had saved the day, and it's clear that since Manning's death he'd continued to steer Bray through the whole operation. Bray's diary is full of references to visiting Gough up at Enfield, often dining there with John Nichols, and in his prefaces he repeatedly pays tribute to Gough's generosity in freely allowing him access to his unparalleled topographical collections. And you can see here Gough's help to Bray in that dark ink all the way through that correspondence. Bray's debt to Gough as an editor and proofreader of the work as it passed through the press is vividly shown by the heavily reworked proof sheets that have recently come to light in the papers of the Lomax family of Shear. These precious survivals allow us to trace the course of printing in great detail and measure the extent to which Bray, Gough, John Nichols and other employees at the Nichols printing house were all involved in preparing Manning's text for publication. The basic pattern seems to have been for Nichols to send the first proof sheets to Gough for checking. He then scribbled his various corrections and queries over these and made suggestions as to further sources that need to be checked. Bray then checked them to iron out queries before Nichols printed the sheets again and again passed them to Gough for approval. John Nichols' son, John Bowie Nichols, by now quite senior in the printing house, would then examine Gough's approved sheets, and finally it would be Nichols himself who would have the ultimate say in pulling the clean sheet off the press. So in the course of this long process, each man made subtle changes to the text, adding cross-references to manuscript or published sources. Many of these additions are identified by 2 asterisks in the final version. We find, for example, that Gough added much material relating to Merton and other parishes. John Nichols also gave Bray access to his copy of the Chronicle of Bermondsey and instructed the compositor to add 13 lines on the Mill of St Saviour's that had appeared in the Gentleman's Magazine in 1790. He provided a transcript of the will of Edward Alleyne of Dulwich and supplied pedigrees of families linked to Surrey that he'd researched for his own History of Leicestershire, and you can see an example of that here. Then there were questions of typographical design to settle. The presentation of historical facts demanded clarity on the printed page, and there are several instances of Gough lamenting Nichols' contraction of authors' names, or Bray pleading that a pedigree be inserted with a minimum description to the text. The fact that the same sheet would travel from London to Enfield to Surrey and back to London allows us to follow these conversations and watch as the tensions rise. Bray wanted the list of John Austen's charitable donations to Shalford to be omitted, but he was overruled. When asked to explain a conflict of sources used, he could only say that he must have used a different book at the British Museum to the one that Manning had seen. Any delay stretched the printing house, which of course had only finite resources of type, presses and men, and always had to juggle them between a host of other jobs. In 1802, John Bowie Nichols complained that Mr. Bray has not sent an answer about the portraits at Loseley where quite to stand for them. Occasionally, a sudden death demanded a last-minute revision. Jane Moore of Loseley is shown on the Guildford proofs as living and unmarried, but Bray has cancelled this with a note, died, unmarried, September 1802. The dates on these proof sheets, which were themselves often franked and posted without any need for an envelope, as you can see here, it just says Richard Gough, Enfield, so we can assume the postman knew his way to his house. The dates on these envelopes show that Guildford was printed between the 22nd of August and the 21st of December 1802, and that a sheet of 8 folios, or 16 pages, took about 3 or 4 days to print. Gough's death in 1809 left Bray with the overwhelming task of revising proofs alone while continuing his research and managing his professional duties. Then, in about 1811, he lost the sight in his left eye and was forced to rely on his right eye, which was short-sighted. Help was at hand, however, in the shape of John Nichols' son, John Bowie Nichols, then in his early 20s, but as we've already seen, a key figure in the printing house and a key local historian. Bray pays tribute to his indefatigable attention and very great accuracy, which left him very little to correct. John Bowie Nichols went on to superintend the printing of nearly all the important county histories published in the early 19th century. Cheshire, Hertfordshire, Durham, Wiltshire, Northamptonshire and Buckinghamshire were all seen through the press by him. In 1809, in the preface to Volume 2, Bray admitted that the editor of a county history undertakes a laborious task on a certainty that from the nature of his subject he can expect the applauses of few, if indeed he attains those of any. The qualifications required for a work of this kind are industry in searching for records and papers, patience in examining them, and accuracy in extracting them. His completion, someone needs to plug this in, but we've nearly finished. That's the last slide, so don't worry, you're not going to miss it. We're nearly there. His completion of Manning's work had taken 13 years, but the subscribers and purchasers had been very well served. Volume 1 in 1804 contained Manning's meticulous facsimile and translation of Domesday Book with a commentary on the text, manorial and church histories, and a list of incumbents to 1786. It also included returns by overseers of the poor, charity returns, and recent population statistics. The second volume, in 1809, was much more of a historical dictionary of the county, with detailed parish histories and family trees based on Manning's notes. The final volume, which came out in 1814, included lists of sheriffs and included an appendix containing topics about Surrey's military history, descriptions of its jails, the iron railway, entomology and fossils. Well, at the age of 78, one would have thought that Bray might have now been happy to sit by his fireside in Shear, but the completion of Surrey seems to have given him a second wind. In the course of the next 15 years, he rose at 4 a.m. during the summer months to edit the diary and correspondence of John Evelyn from the rich stores of papers held at Wootton. And he spent thousands of hours over at Loseley working through the family papers that had been accumulating there in the evidences room since the mid-16th century. The Loseley manuscripts that he published in Archaeologia and made available to John Nichols for his progresses and public processions with Queen Elizabeth and its continuation, the progresses of King James I, did much to alert scholars to their historical significance. His letters to John Bayer Nichols, now preserved at Yale University Library, also show that he was itching to help the historians of Bedfordshire, Buckinghamshire and Northamptonshire, where the Bray family had once held estates. He was still writing articles for the Gentleman's Magazine in 1828, and even as late as March 1831, when he was 95 and practically blind, he was able to tell John Bayer Nichols that he was still alive to the idea of preparing a supplemental volume of the history of Surrey. I'd love to know what Nichols wrote in reply. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Julian. Julian has got a train to catch fairly soon.
Don't worry, there's another one after that.
He's happy to take any questions. One thing I'd like to ask you, when we talk about engraving on these books, what are we talking about somebody engraving onto a copper sheet?
Yes. Yeah, a clean, polished sheet of copper would be etched, would be engraved with a burin, a sharp metal instrument. And it was a very painstaking task. So you're making indentation in the sheet of the image in reverse. And then you're inking it so that when it prints it comes out the right way round. So with Domesday Book they had not only to trace all of that medieval handwriting and all of the contractions over the top, but then they had to engrave it back to front. So you can see why they charged a lot.
Yeah.
What's a tradesman's token for?
These were tokens of coinage that were produced in times of scarcity, I think during the Civil War, when there were shortages of coinage, so tradesmen would have their own sort of private tokens for exchange, a bit like some towns do today. You've got the Lewis pound, haven't you, and things like that. They were used very locally as an agent of exchange, which could then be exchanged for money when pound notes became more available.
Didn't the co-op used to have tokens
Yeah,
years ago?
yeah.
Not that I remember them.
Far too young now.
But it was interesting to hear about historians going balmy, because it encouraged us all to be a bit more tolerant of Brian Buss.
Can I make a comment?
You can.
The one thing that strikes me, the time it took to do these things years ago, I don't think we've got any excuse now for some of our projects take 6, 7, 8 years. And we don't go through all this editing with people writing notes on things.
No.
And I don't want That gentleman over there thinking he's got an excuse.
No, it's an extraordinary thing. You know, this is an age even before regular penny post.
Yes.
So you're relying on a carrier taking your letter and getting it to the right person.
Probably got there quicker than it would today.
Very probably would. Well, and that's the other thing. Obviously, the post registry is another thing completely, and I'm not an expert in that. But you could have an exchange of conversation through letters with somebody several times a day. So
I noticed that printer in Red Line Square had a telephone box outside.
yeah, that was clever.
Must have
Yeah,
been jolly useful.
yeah. You'd think they'd have used that and not written all these lovely letters, wouldn't you? Yes.
Another question, please. Do you think anything's been lost in Surrey's history by all these people putting so much into it and commenting? And just your thoughts on it.
There are always losses. One of the biggest losses at the time when they were printing these books is that by transcribing a document and printing it, they thought they didn't need to keep the document.
That is a,
And so there was an awful lot of destruction.
yeah. So you haven't got all those documents?
Not necessarily,
No.
no. And that was a real problem, especially when they were perhaps printing ancient letters. So we're very lucky to have the Loseley letters, an incredible body of 17th, 16th, 17th, 8th century letters in the Loseley archive, which scholars come from all over the world to see at Surrey. They've survived because they weren't printed in many senses. If they'd gone to a printing press, they'd have been used for wrapping cheese afterwards.
So you would confirm that we all should have an archive somewhere. And perhaps Doug would explain why that question that
Well, we're struggling to raise something of the order of £20,000 to construct a building to hold the archives that we've accumulated over the last 60 or 70 years. We're still hoping to get a grant from Surrey, but we live in hope. We haven't heard from them yet.
Good luck with that one.
So if you could put in a good word.
Oh, I'll try, yes, yes.
Any other questions for Julian?
No, I just have to stretch a little bit.
Thanks, Julian.
Thanks very much.